Well, thank you so much for that. Thank you so much for inviting me back to the Opera House. I remember the first time I spoke here, I thought this is definitely going to be the last time, but it's now, I think, even my fourth time here. So it's an incredibly generous gesture on the part not only of the Opera House, but also of the whole city of Sydney. I can't thank you enough. What I want to talk about today is my new book and the themes that underlie it. And I guess it's worth saying that throughout my career, I've been in search of guidance. I don't believe that the business of living is very obvious. It's not very obvious to me. On a daily basis, I'm reminded of how little I know and how things are extremely complicated and don't necessarily have easy answers. And this has led me to look in a number of different areas for what I could broadly call wisdom. I've looked at the world of philosophy, I've looked at the world of literature, of art, of sociology, and then a few years ago, I began to be interested in the field of religion. Now, this surprised me as much as anyone else because I didn't happen to believe anything and still don't believe anything. And in our society, we assume naturally that those who don't believe won't really care very much for religion and won't be able to see anything in it. But I suppose my whole argument is that that's perhaps not entirely true. One of the major divisions of the world nowadays is between those who believe and those who don't, between atheists, or agnostics, and believers. And for about the last, I would say, 10 years or so, it's been relatively clear in the minds of many what being an atheist means. Being an atheist means someone who not only believes that God doesn't exist, but it also means someone who thinks that anyone who believes that God does exist is a simpleton. Or an idiot, to put it more politely. So in other words, a rather virulent kind of atheism stalks the land that essentially believes that there is something quite wrong with believers. They're not simply making another choice. They've made very much the wrong choice and need their errors pointed out to them in intellectual ways. They've made an intellectual error and therefore they need an intellectual corrective. I've got a few quibbles with this and my approach is slightly different. I don't believe that the question of God's existence or non-existence is the most interesting one in this topic. In fact, I think it's incredibly boring and sterile because one never really makes any headway. You know, on the one hand, you've got the believers who think the atheists are going to hell, and on the other hand, you've got the atheists who think that the believers are rather stupid. And that kind of divide is, for me, painful and sad, and I don't really want to dwell on it. So I'm taking a different road. For me, I am an atheist, and so I want to begin really now with something which may surprise you, and if you feel very strongly about it, please make your ways to the exit, and I won't hold any grudges, but you know, let's be honest with each other. I don't think God exists. Now let's move on, if we can. I think that's the end of the matter. Now, the greater question is, where are we going to go from here? Now we've settled that question, where are we going to go from here? How are we going to live a good life? How are our societies to be managed with that insight in mind? And I suppose I'm writing for someone who's a little bit like me, who thinks something like this. I don't believe in the doctrines of religion, but I do like singing Christmas carols, and I quite like some of the passages of the Old Testament, and I love the music of Bach, and there's something about Zen Buddhist temples, and there's something about the moral structure that you find in certain religions, etc., etc. You know the sort of person, someone who cannot believe but is attracted to aspects of religion. Now, for too long, the choice has been either you sign up to all the doctrines involving many supernatural incidents, etc., and then you get all those nice bits, or you find you can't sign up to these doctrines, and then you're left in a sort of wasteland where there's a lot that isn't really attended to. I want to suggest a different strategy. I want to suggest it not just for myself, but as it were, for our own times. And that's a strategy of stealing from religions, that atheists should learn to inform themselves about what religions are up to, and then selectively steal the best bits. Now, this has been described to me sometimes as a bit of a pick-and-mix approach. And the truth is, that's exactly what it is. And I'm very, very proud of pick and mix when it comes to religion. Some people say, you know, I've rifled through the buffet of religions. Well, that's great. I think that religions are a buffet. They lie before us, and a lot of what you might put on your plate is, to my eyes, not that appetizing. But there are some really lovely bits. So I'm going to go around with my plate around some major religions and pick the nicest bits in my eyes. That is my overt strategy. I don't mean to offend, but I think that if you believe, as I do, that religions are essentially cultural products, that they were made by humans, then there seems to be nothing wrong with choosing among them like one would with any work of culture. I mean, imagine, take music. You know, imagine you like the Beatles, and somebody said, right, you like the Beatles, so I hope you're committed to the Beatles and will listen to every single track and never deviate and make no time for, you know, Robbie Williams, because really, you must stick to the Beatles. That would seem bizarre. We naturally rifle through the buffet of cultures, be it in music or in literature. You can go from a bit of Jane Austen to a bit of Shakespeare to a bit of James Joyce, and that's allowed. You can create a playlist, and that's what I want to suggest that contemporary society can do as regards religion too. So what I want to do tonight is take you through the buffet and show you the bits that I'm picking. You may want to pick out other bits. What I'm trying to show you is a method. Because I think at the end of the day, the method is more important than the particular choices. But let me take you through some of these choices. So one area that I think religions are fascinating in is the area of education. Now, education is something that the secular world prides itself on taking very seriously. Huge amounts of money are devoted to education. And now the question is, what is education for? Well, when politicians talk about it, the prime explanation is that education will provide us with the skills necessary to take up a place in modern capitalism. So education will give us technical and business skills to make our societies richer and safer. But there's another claim that you often hear made on behalf of modern education. And you sometimes catch it during the more lyrical moments of politicians' speeches or at the end of graduation ceremonies. And that's the suggestion that education can, in some ways, make you into a better human being, a fuller, richer, nobler person. It can make you into a grown-up citizen. Now, I like those claims. I think they do sound rather beautiful. And I want to explore them, because I think in some ways we failed to honor that second claim associated with education. And I think we've partly failed to honor it because we've forgotten about religion. Let me explain. In the 19th century, in the UK, church attendance started falling off a cliff. In the middle of the 19th century, the numbers really collapsed year by year. And this set off a real panic amongst many people who wondered where on earth society was going to find its sources of consolation, its ethical framework, its guidance, its morality. Where were these things going to be found? They had been the preserve of religion. Where were they going to be found? Now, there was one influential group, among whom you might call the chattering classes of Britain, who came up with a fascinating answer. People like John Stuart Mill and Matthew Arnold suggested that there was a ready-made replacement for religion, and that replacement was called, with a capital C, culture. Works of culture, ranging from the essays of Plato, the plays of Shakespeare, the novels of Jane Austen, they comprised a corpus of knowledge and wisdom that could do very much all the things that religions have traditionally done. They too could be sources of guidance, of morality, of consolation. In other words, culture can replace scripture. That was the dream of a certain kind of reformer in the mid-19th century. Now, I actually think this was a really good idea. I fervently believe that culture can get us through some of the great challenges of our life. I'd add a few more things like cinema and photography and music, but all of these things together are vital tools to a good life. And I think these reformers were absolutely right. The problem is that that insight has fallen entirely by the wayside as regards the modern educational establishment. I mean, imagine if you went to any university in Australia or even anywhere in the world. Say you went to Harvard, apparently the best university, and you said, look, I've come to study at Harvard because I want to find a moral framework. I need ethical guidance. I need to learn how to love, to live, and to die. The administration people would start looking at you so strangely, they'd be dialing up the ambulance, if not the insane asylum. This is simply not what the modern educational system believes it's in the business of doing. It doesn't believe that it's providing ethical guidance, a moral framework, or consolation. And the reason it doesn't is that it assumes that people, once they've become adults, sort of know how to live. It's fairly obvious business knowing how to live. You know, you get up in the morning and you find a life partner and you have children, you find a job that you like, and you watch your parents die and your friends get ill, and eventually you're diagnosed with a fatal illness, and then it's time for you to head to hospital and gradually shut the coffin and slide yourself easily into the earth. And it's kind of obvious. We don't need help. All of that's kind of pretty much taken care of without any further need. Now, that's their view. So their view is, don't drag culture into the business of telling us how to live. A proper academic, a proper university does not soil itself with these questions. And that's why the university education system is suspicious of questions of relevance. You know, why do we want to make this thing relevant? There's no need. We're rational beings, fully in command of ourselves, and we can make this journey on our own, thanks very much. Now, religions start from a completely different point of view. For a start, for religions, we're only just holding it together. All of us are in trouble, real trouble. For religions, all the major religions at various points call us children. And what do children need? They need help. They need guidance. And so religions assume us to be broken creatures who throughout our lives are going to need help. There is nothing obvious about the business of living, and we will need assistance throughout it, throughout our lives. So guidance is absolutely fundamental. You know, the Christian concept of original sin has many dark undertones and associations. But really what it's trying to get you to take on board is that from the very beginning, there's something a bit wrong with you. That's what religions tend to believe. I think not wrongly, as I'll go on to show. So religions start with this idea of our fragility, and they see themselves as in the business of helping us along that journey. I don't necessarily believe in the advice they give us at every stage along that journey. In fact, only at very select moments can I agree with what they say. But I'm fascinated by how they feel that we need this guidance. Have a think about the ways in which religions deliver their knowledge to people. You know, in the secular world, when people want to deliver knowledge, they give a lecture. When religions deliver knowledge, they deliver a sermon. Now, what's the difference between a sermon and a lecture? Well, a lecture wants to, share some facts, and a sermon wants to change and perhaps save your life. In other words, a much more urgent, didactic process is going on in religions. So, as I say, I don't necessarily believe what they're telling us all the time, or indeed for a lot of the time, but I'm fascinated by the urgency that religions bring to the business of living. And I think there's something that the secular world leaves really quite absent. There's a real gap here. Now, moving slightly along this buffet, kind of a related point, I've been discussing, as it were, the form of education, the content of education, but I will now want to discuss the delivery mechanisms of education that religions are working with. I think religions can be seen as supremely successful educational machines. There's never been educational machines as accomplished as they are. So let's look at what they do. Let's look at how come they're so good at getting their ideas across. Well, one of their first insights is that human beings are incredibly forgetful. Our minds are like sieves. The religions have been very influenced in the West by the Greek insight that we suffer from what the ancient Greek philosophers called akrasia. Now, what is akrasia? Akrasia is translated as weakness of will. So weakness of will suggests that there are lots of things that intellectually we know full well, but practically we don't do or abide by because we get swept away by the hubbub of events. Our wills are weak. And so for religions, what you need to do is to strengthen that will in order to make the knowledge that you actually believe in effective, in order to make ideas stick. So because you're so forgetful, one of the first things that religions recommend that you do is repeat things. All religions emphasize repetition. Think of prayers. At 9 o'clock in the morning, you get down on your knees and you say some stuff. By midday, you'll have forgotten it, so back down on your knees. By evening time, you'll have forgotten it again, so back down on your knees. And now, of course, in the secular world, we associate repetition with sterility. It's like, oh, I've already seen that film. Oh, I read that book a year ago. That's a sort of modern approach. Now, the problem is with that approach is that it does mean that a lot less sticks. Sometimes when you come out of a film, and it's been a really good film, and you come out and you think, wow, I want to transform my life. Because, that sense of energy or love or beauty that was in that film, I want to flood my life with it and kind of make a new start. Problem is, by the time you're having your sandwich at lunchtime the next day, you've forgotten the film. And, the next month, you wouldn't even remember the title. Ditto with books. We forget everything, our minds are like sieves. And yet the secular world keeps thinking that you can sit somebody in a classroom at the age of 20, pour in some really vital stuff, and it'll still be there across a 40-year career in management consultancy. The problem is, it generally doesn't work like that. So religions are much more careful. They're careful with time. Now, what all the religions do is manage our calendars. Our diaries tend to be packed with lots of things. But when you look at what they're packed with, they tend to be packed with the appointments of capitalism, a meeting here, a business appointment, a checking in with a tax inspector. They're things that we need to keep our working lives going or our social lives going. That's what we put in our diaries. Now, religions are interesting because they have diaries, all of them have diaries, but they put slightly different things in those diaries. They put things related to our inner self. They try and give us appointments with psychologically important ideas from a belief that unless they are in our diaries, we'll just forget about them. So they want to lend structure. So every religion has a structure of some sort. So take Catholicism, on the 31st of March, you will be thinking about St. Jerome and his qualities of humility and patience, etc. Every day has an idea associated with it. And I think it's rather useful because I think many of the things that we care a lot about do slip through the cracks. Take the moon, right? Looking at the moon is, I think, a really wonderful, beautiful, calming thing to do. You look at the moon and you think, well, I'm so small, this thing's so far away, the universe is so large, and somehow your soul is still, some of the anxieties of the day lessen as you look up at the moon. And often one thinks, oh, I should do this a little bit more often. But the problem is that we don't. None of us spend much time looking at the moon, and the reason is we're too busy, other things come along, etc., so it goes by the wayside. But if you're a Zen Buddhist, you've got an appointment with the moon. And that appointment comes in the middle of September at the festival of Tsukimi, where you'll be asked out of your house and made to stand on specially made canonical platforms, and you'll sing some songs and recite poetry in honor of the moon, and you will remember the fragility of life, the importance of friendship, and the brevity of life on earth, all the while eating some rice cakes. So it's a charming ritual, a charming ceremony designed to put a place in the diary for psychologically important ideas. And that's really what a ritual is. Religions are full of rituals. What is a ritual? A ritual is a social event that has as its ultimate goal some inner transformation, some psychological transformation. And rituals really throw up the difference between modern society and religious society. Modern society is obsessed with spontaneity. We think we'll find our way to the important stuff on our own, in our own time. No one should tell me what to do and when to do it. It should just bubble up. And the problem, however beguiling that is as an idea conceptually, the problem is, we don't really do it. Take springtime. Another lovely ritual that you find in Judaism this time is called Birkat Hilahot, where every springtime you take a rabbi, or the rabbi takes you out into the fields, and you look at the new blossom on the trees, and you recite some poetry and some prayers in honor of the beauty of the fields and of the new year. Now, Wordsworth was also doing this. If you read Wordsworth, that's what it's all about, or a lot of it's about, welcoming the new year, blossoms, etc. The problem is, and the reason why the ritual of Birkat Hilahot has got an edge over Shakespeare in some ways, is that none of us really read not Shakespeare, Wordsworth. The problem is that none of us actually read Wordsworth. Well, we might have touched on him at university, but basically, you're not really going to go and dig out your Wordsworth nowadays. It's something that is a theoretical possibility that gets left by the wayside, and religions, much more forceful, try and timetable that. Now, the other thing that religions know in the field of education and delivery of education is that if you have an important idea, it's not enough simply that it is important and reasonable. You need to get it across in a convincing way, and in order to get it across so that it will stick, you need to be a really good public speaker. I'm letting you down here, but that's the idea. You need to be a really good public speaker. Otherwise, however good the idea is, it's just going to fall limp, which is, again, why the major religions invest a lot in oratory. And you find this at its best, probably, in the American South, in the Pentecostalist tradition. And any of you who've been to a Pentecostalist service on a Sunday down in the American South will know it's an extraordinary event. You know, these preachers are amazing. They'll say some stuff, and when it gets really convincing and good, people will say, Amen, Amen, Amen. And if there's a really rousing point, then members of the congregation will stand up and say, thank you, Savior, thank you, Jesus, thank you, Christ. And there's a kind of call and response with the audience. And, you know, it's a real frenzy. Now, compare that with a modern university. Everybody's there. And, you know, because the prof thinks that it's enough, that, you know, he's got a PhD and his ideas are really logical, so he thinks that's enough. But the problem is it's not, because it's not going to stick. And so my suggestion is that some of the profs be sent over to Alabama for a little bit of instruction with these Pentecostalist guys, so that at the end of our university lectures, you'll get people standing up going, you know, thank you, Montaigne, thank you, Shakespeare, thank you, Jane Austen. And there'll be, you know, some real energy in the room. But until then, things are going to be quiet in the university. Now, there's something else that religions remember when they're trying to teach us something. And that is that we are not merely brains. We are not merely machines of reason. We are embedded creatures. In other words, we exist within bodies that are sensory, that are passionate. We have senses of smell, of sight, of hearing, of touch. And if you want to try and teach someone something, religions allege, you have to involve these senses. It's not enough simply to target reason. And so all religions do this to one extent or another. Take again Zen Buddhism. One of the most charming lessons of Buddhism is delivered along with a drink of a beverage. And that is the Zen Buddhist Tea Ceremony. Now, what is the Zen Buddhist Tea Ceremony? At one level, it's a lesson in the brevity of life, the importance of friendship, the value of the community, all of these things. But it's not just lectured to you. It's combined with the ritual drinking of some hot tea. And there's a curious collaboration, if you like, sympathy between the moral of the words that are used and the moral of the tea. So something physical is supporting something psychological or intellectual, if you like. And you find religions doing this all the time. Take in Judaism. Judaism, a religion really interested in forgiveness, in notions of forgiveness. But you don't just hear lectures on forgiveness. If you live in an Orthodox community, every Friday, the rabbi will lead you to the mikveh, the ritual bath, which is often in a beautiful setting. And you're asked to go back over the week, confess to things that you've done, and ask for forgiveness both of your friends and also of God. And then you plunge into some water from head to toe. You have a really good soak. Now, I think all religions recognize that there's some connection between water and lessons. You find this across the religions. And we know this from our own lives, our secular lives. You know, sometimes when you want to change your mood or in some ways, you say, I'm going to take a bath. I'm going to take a bath. But the really life-changing capacity of water, the capacity of immersion to effect a change, is something that only religions are picking up on with their full depth. And I mention this because it's a characteristic move of these religions, to employ the body to make a lesson. Let me go on to a few other things on the buffet. Another area that I think religions are really interested in is the world of art. Now, in the secular world, we think we've got art pretty well wrapped up because we invest a lot in museums, in galleries. There's a lot of surplus wealth that goes towards the arts. But I want to suggest that in a way, our relationship to the arts is not going as well as it could be, and that some of the reason is that we haven't properly studied how religions use art. It's sometimes said that museums are our new cathedrals, but in some ways, I don't think they're quite doing what cathedrals did for various reasons. One of the reasons why art isn't quite living up to its message or the claims we make for it is that we're obsessed in the modern world with that ancient or the old 19th century adage which says that art should be for art's sake. In other words, that a successful work of art exists in its own realm, in the aesthetic world, and that it shouldn't have an attempt to change society or to have an impact directly on people. It exists in art world, in that special world called the world of art. The other piece of ideology that surrounds the display and interpretation of art is a veneration of mystery. It's almost as though the more complex and interesting a work of art, the harder it will be to explain what it's doing or what's going on. And so nice people like you, when you go to a museum, particularly a museum of contemporary art, one of the common feelings one comes away thinking is, what did that mean? And that's often a feeling you often get reading museum catalogues, which often seem as though they're translated from the German, even when they're not. So there's a kind of air of mystery, and there's an air of removal from daily life. Now, this is not at all what religions believe when it comes to art. When it comes to art, religions are very simple about what art is for. Art is for two things. Firstly, it's to remind you of what is good, how you should live, the good way to live. And secondly, it's to remind you of what's bad, what's unfortunate, what's sad, what's away from fulfillment. So that's the dual mission of art. In other words, art is didactic, and it's a piece of propaganda. Art, all religious art, is propaganda. Now, when people hear the word propaganda, it's never too far till somebody thinks of Hitler and somebody else thinks of Stalin. And so in saying this, I'm aware that I'm on a slippery slope. But I want us to try and hang on to somewhere in the middle of that slippery slope. We don't necessarily have to tumble down to the bottom. And I think religions show us how. Because if you look at the history of religious art, the sort of things that propaganda has been made on behalf of have often been some quite nice things. I mean, take something like Rembrandt's Christ Crossing the Sea of Galilee. Beautiful painting, a piece of propaganda on behalf of what? The fascist state or the workers' paradise? No, it's a piece of propaganda on behalf of courage. It's trying to remind you of what courage is like, and it's trying to instill in you a sense of how you might be more courageous by looking at the example of some courageous guys who were crossing the Sea of Galilee one day. And now, why do religions think that we need this kind of art? Why are they calling up people like Rembrandt? The reason for religions doing this is that they think that there are all sorts of ideas that we have in our minds that basically lie dormant and ineffective until they are reawakened by a work of art. Art turns cliches into things that we actually believe in and can act by. So we all believe, for example, that it's nice to be nice, and that we should be good, and we should love our children, we should love the environment, and all these things. And we know all of this, and it's all wise, and it's all true. Problem is, we don't really tend to act on it until a great work of art comes along. And I'm thinking, it could be a film by Tarkovsky, or Hey Jude by the Beatles, or whatever it is, and suddenly you think, that's what love is. Or that's why I should be, caring about the world, or loving my children, or trying to be more tolerant of my partner, or whatever it is. We are reminded in a visceral, active sense of truths which would otherwise have left us cold. And that's why religions believe that you need some artists to hand. And that's why they've had the phone numbers of some of the greatest artists in the world at all times. They knew who to call, and they knew the art needed to be good, because if it was going to be bad art, the message wasn't going to get across. Now, just think about how different that is to the way the modern world works. In the modern world, there are people of ideas, right? They write their books and they do their things. But do they ever call up, the great artists, the great filmmakers? No, not really. The artists are in one corner and the sort of thinkers are in another. But the way you have to conceive of religion is it's joined up. The thinkers are in touch with the artists. The thinkers might be telling the artists what to produce. Very, very different from a kind of modern mindset. But I think it may be just very important to do that. There may be something quite essential about animating our beliefs by using the works of the great artists. I suppose what religions are really saying is that the aesthetic realm is not just superficial, that the way things look and feel and sound isn't just something over there that belongs to kind of House and Garden magazine or interior design or some sort of trivial thing. It's right at the center of importance, and it's important because we as humans respond to sensory material. I remember a few years ago, I was looking to get married, and I thought, right, well, how am I going to do this? Where shall I go as a non-believer? And I thought, right, well, I'm not going to go to a church or anything like that because that would be wrong. So I called up an organization. I looked on the website of an organization called the British Humanist Association, and I clicked on their website, and from the moment the screen came up, I thought, ooh, something's a bit wrong here, because it looked like it had been done by a 12-year-old, the website. You know how HTML goes a bit wrong and it's a bit wonky. Anyway, and then I thought, well, I'll keep going. And then there was a bit where it said, find your own celebrant, this guy who's going to help you to celebrate. So I clicked on the celebrant, and some pictures came up. And I looked at the pictures of the possible celebrants I was going to entrust to this special day, and I thought, oh dear. And I thought, their clothes, they're so badly dressed. And then I read their prose that they put about things, and I thought, oh, there's so many spelling mistakes, and it's not very eloquent. Now, this could sound sort of bitchy and superficial, but I don't mean it to. What I'm trying to say is that if we're to make a viable world beyond religion, we're going to have to study what religions get up to very carefully, and we're going to have to learn that hats are really important, and shoes are really important, and clothes are really important, and the way that language is put together is really important. And we can't just say, right, well, there were some errors in the tales of the loaves and fishes, and Genesis doesn't quite stack up, so that's enough. We're going to need to work a little bit harder, and religions know this. Let me move on a bit. Something else, moving on the buffet, something else that religions are very practiced in and sort of intelligent about, and that is that if you want to change the world, you've got to get organized, right? You've got to group together with other people. It's not a coincidence that the major religions are also known as organized religions. In other words, it's not just a chap or two with a good idea, it's a group of people who've coalesced and have shown discipline around a set of ideas. Now, it's interesting, when you look at the modern world, when you look at people who are interested in what one could broadly call the soul, I'm using that in a completely supernatural way, the soul, the inner part, the kind of the weighty, important stuff. The people who are interested in the soul, in the modern world, are basically lone practitioners. They're the poets in their bedrooms, the writers in their bedrooms, the guitar players, the psychotherapists, the painters. They're all off in their little sheds, in their little studios, doing their stuff, saving the world. And in other words, the view is, if you care about the soul, you're on your own. You're supremely individual, and that's a legacy of that romantic worldview that crops up in the 19th century, which says, if you've got an important contribution to make to humanity, speak alone with your own voice. Only the singular lone voice is important. Don't learn to read a spreadsheet. Don't group with other people. Speak purely from the mountaintop. So that's the kind of modern worldview. Now, religions differ a lot. They are organized. They are multinational. They have rules on how to behave. They are branded. They're the leaders in branding. And they show extreme coherence in a lot of areas. Now, the only thing that's comparable to religions in the modern world is multinational corporations. If you look at the structure of multinational corporations and religions, they're eerily similar. Branded, multinational, disciplined, etc. Lots and lots of similarities. Except they do, of course, slightly different things. The religions are in the soul space. They're doing the kind of soul bit, feeding our soul. And the multinationals tend to be in the more physical space. They're shipping us cement or selling us pizzas or shoes or whatever it is. So we've got, in the modern world, we've got the soul-focused religions, well organized. You've got the religion, you've got the corporations that are well-disciplined and focused, but they're selling us shoes. And on the other hand, you've got the poets and the psychotherapists in their bedrooms. And this seems kind of striking, and I think a real loss. no wonder, in a way, that religions continue to be so powerful and that the messages of the very good ideas that secular society has come up with often don't get through to us. The revenues of the Catholic Church last year were $97 billion. When people scratch their heads and go, why is it that Catholicism remains a very powerful force in the world when some of their arguments don't make much sense? Well, look at that $97 billion for a moment at least. They're very organized. They're pooling together the intelligence of large numbers of people, and they're showing great discipline. In other words, I'm trying to suggest that if in the secular world the ideas that we fervently believe in are to have real traction in the world, we may have to think about organization, that organization seems key to getting things across, and that the lone practitioner, however pure he might be, however untainted by commerce and fellowship with others, is ultimately a very, very weak voice in a lonely world. We tend to assume that if you want to change the world, just write a book, and then that all will be fine. But religions are not just books. They may have books at their center that are very important, but they're also about schools, and they're about music, and they're about eating, and they're about calendars, and they're about funeral services, they're about all of this sort of stuff. And to think you can move on by just chucking a few wisely aimed arguments against them and the whole edifice will collapse, dream on. Of course it won't. Right, I want to move on to just a few other things on the menu. Let's look at community. One of the things that religions are indisputably rather good at doing is creating communities, turning strangers into friends. And one of the things the secular world clearly has a problem with is community. I think the modern world is lonely. We're all hunting for that one very special person. That's how we start off, in adolescence, in our early 20s. We're searching for that one very, very special person who can spare us a need to mix with everybody else. So we're all kind of selfishly looking for, that special person. But the group is, we don't really like the group. I think it's actually very important to live in groups, and I think a lot of our neuroses and anxieties comes from the fact that we're not living in a sufficiently group way. Now, don't get me wrong. In the modern city, in Sydney, in Melbourne, in London, there are all sorts of gatherings all the time of people, like tonight and everywhere. Places where you can hang out with people. There are bars and restaurants. So for someone to come along and go, we're lonely, there's no one around, that's clearly wrong. There are lots of people. The problem is we don't talk to them, ever. Unless I perform a exercise, which could both be embarrassing and quite fun, but I don't think I will, of doing that thing that many religions do, which is asking everybody to introduce everybody to each other by turning to the left and the right. But I won't do that quite yet. We'll see how it goes. You guys are not going to get to know each other. You're just going to file out, and that's it. Now, religions regularly take people into a space, and they basically perform a host function. They introduce them to each other. They introduce us to each other. Now, I think below the surface, we're not as grumpy as we look. When we're walking around, we're all a bit grumpy, sort of look a bit strange. And the reason is we're scared. We're scared of rapists, and we're scared of murderers, and we're just scared of all the bad people we've read about, and pedophiles and nasty people. So that's why we've got to be very careful as we wander around. But deep down, under a layer, we're actually quite friendly. Most of us are friendly. The problem is that it normally takes a flood, a fire, or a snowstorm until anyone talks to anyone else, because it's just too sort of embarrassing. Someone did say to me, look, that's just because you're in England. But I suspect it's a little bit everywhere. Anyway, so what do we need to bring out our sociability? What we need is a good host. Now, you know the host from a party, right? So, again, quite English. When you go to a typical English party with a bad host, everybody's standing like this, looking quite glum, sheepishly with their drink, and it's all quite stiff and quite awkward. But if there's a good host, they'll go, look, you meet so-and-so, you meet so-and-so, you talk to so-and-so, and suddenly the party is going. Now, writ large, without any disrespect, religions are hosts in their societies. They introduce people, they bring people in a room, and they say, it is safe to talk to people here. It's a very basic thing. It doesn't require belief in the supernatural. Many people will often say, look, I've kind of lost my faith a while ago, but I do love those services. I do love the after bit when you have the tea and the biscuits and that kind of thing. And they're not wrong. Why are they like this? Because there's not much else going on. So some people say, well, what about the football club or the swimming club or the pub? And the problem is that not everybody likes swimming or football or anything else. That we don't all belong to these specialized hobby groups. The modern world has hobby groups whereas religions have communities. And the difference between a hobby group and a community is that in a community, a group of people are gathered who have, in a sense, nothing in common with each other. They look weird to each other, they're different races, ages, colors, etc. And maybe they're a bit scary looking. But the whole process, the kind of spiritual journey, is to turn that alien person into a human being, to discover the humanity below the surface. And that seems like an incredibly sort of valuable exercise that religions make us do. Now, I'm really running on, so I'm going to conclude. Really what I want to end by saying is that even if you don't believe in anything, as I don't believe in anything, it really seems vital to learn enough about religion that you can draw on those bits of it that still seem to have an awful lot going for them. If you're in the world of community building, look at how religions build community. If you're in the art world, look at how religions do art. If you're an educator, look at how religions educate. Ultimately, and I want to end with this point, ultimately religions are far too complex, wise, rich, nuanced, to be abandoned simply to those who actually happen to believe in them. They're for all of us, especially non-believers. Thank you very much.
But I did want to start with one question from Alison Badajoz, who says to Alain, your latest book refers heavily to Christianity, Judaism and Buddhism, but rarely mentions Hinduism or Islam. Why was that?
Well, I knew from the start that this wasn't going to be a work of comparative religion. This wasn't going to be a work where I kept comparing one religion to another. If there is a comparison, it's between the secular world and the world of religions. And for this, you don't necessarily need an infinite array of religions. What matters is to get to know some religions really well, and they double themselves up in many, many areas. So I didn't want another Abrahamic religion, having already got Judaism and Christianity, and I was very fascinated by Buddhism, which I didn't know that much about, and now know a little bit more about. So it was a personal choice, and I'll almost say one shouldn't read too much into it.
We had some wonderful questions from Oliver Damien, who says, do you consider that the cultural memes atheists can borrow from religion will be as potent if they are divorced from the bedrock of a firm belief in a supernatural reality, which arguably is what gives them their power?
Look, I think this is an anxiety on the part of many. I mean, when I was in London, I did a debate with a Catholic priest, and he said to me, rather waspishly, I thought, he said, look, you think you understand Bach, but you don't. And he said, you think you've looked at Titian, but your eyes are closed. And, and he said, and you think you've read John Donne, but you haven't. And I sort of started getting a bit depressed about this. And then I thought, well, look, I don't know what you're getting out of all this stuff. I don't know what the full strength dose feels like. But as far as I'm concerned, it's not bad. I'm really revving up there with the Mass in B minor by Bach. It's doing something for me. So I think it's always going to be possible for believers to say to non-believers, you don't get it, do you? To which, as a non-believer, one can only say, perhaps, but I don't have access to the kind of sensory data you do. So all I can say is, it seems enough. I think we can be getting on with quite a lot and getting quite a lot out of cultural works, even without the supernatural structure for which they were indeed once invented or created.
Can we go back briefly to your question about organisation and your very funny reference to the psychotherapists and the artists in their bedrooms? How do you think they could get out?
How could they get out? That's a big question. Look, take something like psychotherapy, which is really close to my heart. If in London, first of all, if you go and see a therapist, people will still say, "Oh, I'm terribly sorry. How is your madness?" And you want to say, "Look, it's not that bad. It's not, I'm just trying to, get more out of life and whatever." But the dominant assumption, you are a marked person, you're crazy. And then when you call up the psychotherapist, you shuffle along to your GP and you ask for a therapist and you get referred and you dial a number in Hampstead and then somebody picks up with a Hungarian voice and goes, hello? And you think, hello, I'd like to make an appointment, hello? And the whole thing, and you sound, the whole thing is just intimidating and peculiar and very, very odd. And I contrast that with the priesthood. Contrast that with the Catholic priesthood. Now, after one said every last horrid thing about the priesthood and paedophile priests and blah, 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 all of which I'm well on top of, very well aware of, don't forget for a minute, the priesthood is still a rather interesting institution. Really, what it is a group of people whose task is to minister us through the key stages of life, from birth to death, and to offer advice, consolation, reflection, conversation, etc. Now, what's the equivalent of that? We don't really have it. The equivalent is probably psychotherapy. But the psychotherapists are in their bedrooms. So what do we need to do? Look, I mean, I'm sure there are some entrepreneurs in the room. The question is not different from any other a problem requiring what one might call an entrepreneurial solution. It requires that we band together the therapists, that we give them a nice logo, that we give them a coherent pattern, etc., and that we learn why religions are effective, and we use that when designing something that might work for the secular world. So taking inspiration and being creative. I think, we're still at the dawn of history. Sometimes it can feel like we're really, really at the end of everything, the Romans and all the rest of it, so long ago, and we've tried everything. And the basic assumption is, if it's a good idea, it's already been done. And if anyone's suggesting now anything at this very late stage, it must be mad. Let's reverse that. We're very much beginning things. We're learning to live, many of us now, for the first time, the first generation, without organized religion. And we're stumbling around, and we haven't necessarily got all the answers. But I very much believe that this is a creative moment.
Do we have someone at microphone 2?
Oh, sorry, a bit short. Hello, Alain, I'm Sally. It's a bit related to that last question. I'm on the same page with you so far. That's great. I'm just wondering, what's the next step? Where is this organisation going to come from? Are you the next leader, or are you merely a prophet for somebody coming along? Yeah. And will this new group include the phrase "pick and mix" in the title?
Right. One of the funny things about publishing a book is that some people say it's absolutely terrible and it's awful, and then sometimes you get emails going, "Look, I've read your book and I'd like to sign up. Where do I sign up?" And I'd like to give you all my wealth and devote myself to you. So this can happen. It hasn't. The last bit was exaggerated, but it can happen. Look, my answer is, I think we are beyond the world of organization at the level of neo-religious organization, in the sense of, one structure with one head, directing things, etc. So I believe in organization, but in miniature organization, the organizations of the therapists, or the organization of people who are going to bury people or marry people appropriately, etc. There's lots to be done, and there's lots to be organized, but I don't think the creation of a new papacy with a secular pope is on the cards or is in any way desirable. We live in a wiki world where truth is multiple, where we're fiercely individualistic, and insofar as we do organize ourselves, it's in relatively spontaneous clusters. And I think the answer is, look, my book is full of suggestions of things that need doing in the secular world. Everything from building community to, organizing the therapists, to reorganizing travel. There's a whole host of sort of ideas. And my hope is that, reading the book, someone might think, "Oh, that's a good idea. I might have a go doing that," and they would organize themselves. And so it's not like it's going to be a central thing. It might just be something that you're inspired by. Or someone might say, "Look, my idea is not in this book at all, but there's something that's kind of analogous that will inspire me." So I'm aiming to seed inspiration and get the reader working. By all means, organized, but no new papacy.
And we were so looking forward to the shoes and the hats. At microphone number 4.
Thank you. Mr. De Botton, you spoke about universities and their role. I'm just interested to know where you think they should be really fulfilling a similar purpose in society to what you've spoken about, turning people into grown-up citizens, because universities only are going to educate in Australia about a third of our citizens. What about the other 2/3? Shall they stay not grown up, or is there something else for them?
Well, first of all, I'd say a third is not bad. So at least if we got the 1/3 right, that would be a really good start. We could then work on the next 2/3. So looking at the first third, religions, institutions of higher education are failing there. as far as I'm concerned, in delivering that promise. And as I tried to suggest in my talk, they're partly failing because they have a non-instrumental view of learning. They do not believe that there is a particular purpose that can be frankly stated in a few words to studying literature or philosophy or theatre or the arts or whatever. The importance, one tends to get tautologies. It's important because it's important. And anyone who asks why is either a government official trying to reduce funding or a vulgar, nasty person, an accountant who's trying to make life meaner, rather than just someone who genuinely wants to know. So that's the 1/3. As for the other 2/3, let's look at how the dominant mood of society is set. It's set through the mass media. And the interesting thing about the mass media is that we've abandoned that to the free market. The secular world believes in the free market in all sorts of areas, including the world of ideas. And the underlying reason for that free market is a belief deep down that a lot of what you read and hear doesn't really matter. So, if you've spent an hour driving and you've looked at a billboard selling you chocolate and another billboard selling you a holiday in Thailand and a third billboard selling you a 4x4, doesn't really matter. It's not going to sink in. It's not really important. That's the kind of official thing. It doesn't really matter what we see and read. All that matters is, we're such grown-ups, so of course we know what we want. We're not going to get sidetracked by an advert, Now, of course, if you think about that, of course we are going to get sidetracked by an advert. But then that's really tricky for the governments to take on board, because if we're going to get sidetracked by an advert, that means there shouldn't be any advertising, which is a real nuisance if you're relying on tax dollars to keep things going. So suddenly you're in a really tricky political area where commercial propaganda, if you like, turns out to have quite a big impact. And the question as a society we have to try and work up is, in the so-called free market of ideas, what ideas do we want out there? Is it right that the only people who can pay for a billboard are certain corporations with certain intentions on us? And do we want to level that playing field? And I guess I'd just like to draw your attention to the way that religions are very, very concerned with public space. They know that public space affects the inner being. In the secular world, we think public space can be sold off to the highest bidder, and it doesn't really matter. Religions think, no, public space influences private space, and you've got to watch it carefully.
We'll go to microphone 3, and then we will turn around and talk to this gentleman here. So microphone 3.
Thank you very much. My name's Nicholas, and can I say thank you very much to Alain De Botton. I was reading it when I was 16, and it's been a long time coming. I'm glad I got to hear you speak. Now, I completely agree with your first premise that, atheism is right and that there isn't a God and that, we should all consider how to live. The problem with trying to find an atheistic institution, in my mind, is that the religions always have an advantage in that they have one central source of authority. Once you take your central premise that there isn't a God, how to live can become very interesting. You can have moral relativists who believe that, we can go over and live in carrots and kill people, and then you can have people who believe in Kant's golden rule. And so having a group where you can discuss how to live within different frameworks becomes a lot more complicated because, in religions, you at least have one framework to work with.
Yeah, I think that's a really good question and a really good anxiety, because it's an anxiety right at the heart of modern society. We live in a world of moral relativism. And what is moral relativism? Moral relativism is the fear that any assertion could be shot down from another side. So, look, I don't believe in eating babies, but maybe you believe in eating babies, so we better watch out. I believe that it's fine to hit children, but maybe you don't. So we've got to be very, very careful about saying anything, because we might upset somebody, and anything that you say might get you back the retort, who are you to tell me what to do? Now, my secret conviction is that there's an awful lot of agreement. There's in fact far more agreement than disagreement. And rather than imagining that once religion has disappeared, we can't agree on anything and we're just left in this complete moral vacuum where we don't know what to do or what to believe or who to trust, actually, if you gather a group of Australians like everyone in this hall tonight, and if you said to them, okay, let's take a poll about what people believe, I would suspect that there would be enormous congruence around some central beliefs. I think the people here will tend to believe in love, in kindness, in generosity towards children, in generosity towards strangers, in the environment, etc., and equal opportunity and fairness. A lot of assumptions can be generalized from and made to be at the heart of secular society. We don't lack things to believe, and we don't lack things that we can agree on. What we lack is things that will make the ideas that we already agree on stick and effective at key moments of our journey through life. So basically what this gentleman is saying is that if you look beneath the surface of many works of modern culture, you will find a religious substructure. The gentleman was talking about Lord of the Rings. Now, I agree that if you look beneath many works of modern culture, you do find, if you follow the work of someone like Joseph Campbell, you do see that there are these archetypes, the hero, the myth, the mother, the return, the prodigal son, etc. These are our stories. Now, sometimes religious people say, aha, this shows that we're right, because it shows that even though you guys think you are secular, in fact, you are still following our stories. Now, as an atheist, I would flip that round and I would go, look, it doesn't mean to say that anyone is right. It just means that there are some archetypes in the human mind, which religions have drawn on and non-religions have drawn on. And so it goes. I wouldn't privilege the fact that these myths have cropped up perhaps first and foremost within religious texts. This seems to be more an accident of timing than a feeling that this is divinely revealed.
Good evening. Thank you very much. It was a fascinating talk. I've got a double-barreled question because I believe in getting my money's worth. I was interested to know whether there was a precedent, if you were blazing a new trail, or whether there are any thinkers or philosophers that you're aware of that have explored this territory before. And I was also curious to know about the reaction from various religions and perhaps some of the other classical pitbull atheists such as Richard Dawkins, if they had come out swinging against your blasphemous work.
Yeah. Well, to answer that, there was weirdly a small cheer at my publisher Penguin when Richard Dawkins did come out and very grumpily said the whole thing's very unnecessary. We're all okay as it is. And in a way, it was interesting because in the worldview of some of these more militant Oxford atheists, the idea is that life is a relatively easy business to get through. You do your scientific research, you're at high table, and things are basically okay. And there are just lots of sort of horrible thick people out there who are all the time, just weeping at Mary and believing in odd things, and they just need to be set right with some solid reason. And I think what they tend to underestimate is vulnerability. And I think that's what emotionally I have a problem with there. We are clearly all vulnerable creatures, and to try and persuade someone out of their religion without paying attention to the vulnerability and its role in their religiosity seems, I think, a cynical ploy. So anyway, so the atheists, yes, a certain kind of militant atheist has been out. I received a wonderful email. Someone said, "You have betrayed atheism." Which seems to be paradoxical. But as for precedent in history, yes, look, there was one guy called Auguste Comte, the French 19th century sociologist, who in the mid-19th century analyzed modern society and decided that we were all going to fall apart and fall prey to mental disorders and anxieties because the only thing that secular society was going to be living for was work and romantic love. And he believed that a society fixated on work and romantic love would be twitchy. And he didn't put it like that, but essentially we have a wide variety of nervous disorders. And he believed that what he had to do was to invent a religion, a secular religion that could help people to cope with their anxiety. So he invented this religion called the Religion for Humanity. It was very, very batty indeed, but quite touching. It had at its center a maternal figure who was actually Comte's girlfriend. Although they weren't actually sleeping together, it was very much unrequited love. And he thought that by making her this head of this new religion, she would be grateful. And indeed, I'm not making this up, indeed she was, and they did sleep together, but then she fell prey to terrible nervous disorders of the kind the 19th century produced. And he went crazy, and the whole experiment collapsed. But nevertheless, it's a fascinating thing, and if ever you find yourselves in a big library, look up Auguste Comte and I mentioned him in my book, because he's onto something rather interesting, and he holds a place, lots of sociologists are aware of him, and he never quite goes entirely out of fashion, because he's touching a raw nerve that I think we know has not yet been appeased or kind of dealt with in the modern world.
Number 2.
You may be familiar with the fact that there is a small schoolyard tiff going on in our capital city of Canberra today. And I wonder that apart from perhaps from shinier shoes, what you feel our political leaders may be able to draw from religion to restore public faith.
Goodness. Well, look, let me give you a non-religious answer, which is mine. I think the fact you're having this squabble is not a sign that Australia has reached a new low. It's a sign of real privilege. It's a sign that you guys have it good, because most countries can't afford this sort of behavior. So even though it's a little bit tedious and a little bit peculiar, enjoy it. It's not going to last long. They're going to sort it out and have fun with it. Yeah.
I think that's probably the most interesting response to this whole thing that any of us are going to hear. Number 3.
It's actually, I guess, a follow-up on that question. If attendance at church collapsed in the 19th century, in the late 20th century, the similar collapses in belonging to a political organisation. What do you think? Do you think politics played the role of religion in the meantime between the 19th century and now, and is now failing to do that for a secular world? And do you think that the last bastion of that politics as religion is in the American presidential kind of system?
Well, look, I think that one of the great innovations and wisdoms of Christianity was the separation of church and state, at least for a time and in its original form, render unto Caesar, etc. The idea that there is earthly power and spiritual power. And even in a secular context, that distinction continues. And I think that most people in Australia, in the UK, in many modern societies, take it really badly when we feel that political power, is edging into the world of religion, in other words, the world of ethics, the world of the soul, etc. When David Cameron responded to the London riots last summer, he started making comments in praise of personal morality and discipline, etc. And the world went nuts. No one allowed a politician to say that sort of thing. We don't want our politicians to do that. That's a very ingrained thing. So by all means, organize and use a public voice for issues of morality and ethics, etc. But I think the ability to join up political power with moral authority, at this point, I probably will invoke Hitler and Stalin, which I was resisting doing. I do think that at that point, the slope gets really steeper. So I am not for giving a moral authority to Julia or Kevin. That said, I did give, 2 nights ago, I gave my book to Julia. We were staying in the same hotel, the Park Hyatt in Melbourne, and I went to give her my book. So we'll see what happens.
And we thought that she was staying up late at night making phone calls.
I just wanted to ask, I think that the way that you explain how secular society can draw from the traditionalism and the repetitiveness of religion is a really good thing. I love how you explain that. But I also want to ask, do you think that there's a detriment or a stagnation that comes from traditionalism in an emergent society such as ours, where our understanding is always changing and we're learning new things all the time about our world and our reality, and that's always shifting? Do you think that traditionalism actually stagnates, that update or that shift in thinking, or like a good example of that would have been Galileo and his discovery of our place in the solar system and how that was rejected by traditionalist structures.
Yeah. Well,
but then years later.
I think it's really good that you mentioned Galileo, because that reminds us that insofar as the modern world is addicted to novelty, what's often driving that is science. And I absolutely believe that's right, that science needs to march forward. And if we were to keep repeating the experiments of Pythagoras, we'd be lost. So I don't believe in repetition in the scientific or technological area, but there is a real distinction between that area and what you could more broadly call the humanistic area. This crops up in, not to knock the universities, but let's have one more knock. The way in which the universities are arranged is you get scientists in universities who are trying to advance knowledge, and they're trying to push ahead and do new things all the time. And they have fantastic discoveries, they're inventing retinas and growing toenails, etc., and doing wonderful things. And then there are the guys in the humanities departments, and they think, well, we better pretend to be like scientists. So we're going to invent a new discovery, and we're going to a new interpretation of Wordsworth, and a new interpretation of the letter in Keats, or the way that Proust used the alphabet, or the way that Joyce used the full stop. A new vital discovery in the world of the humanities. This is the way that the modern university works. And I think most people who've looked at that close up think, well, that's actually nonsense, because in this area, unlike in science, repetition is possible because our psyches, as we all know, don't show dramatic evolution minute by minute. That the truths that we need to feed our souls are relatively stable ones. We keep coming back to some of the same themes. And if you look, indeed, at the history of literature, they circle. Things are already circling. The great artists are circling. We're all circling. And that's okay. So I would make that distinction.
Is Facebook part of the problem, or is it part of the potential solution?
Right.
Is Facebook part of the problem, or is it part of the potential solution?
Well, I don't think it's in itself part of the solution, because it's a typical modern instrument in grouping people together by what they like, by their personality. And as I tried to point out, what's interesting about the religion as a community is that it's literally a group of strangers who might not like each other very much. In all religions, there's an idea of hospitality to the stranger. Literally, someone you think, ooh, I don't want to sit with that person, they look horrid. But nevertheless, you're supposed to sit down with them, and even though they're a bit smelly maybe, or they speak a foreign language, or they just look a bit odd, the point is that you undergo a journey to see the humanity in that person. And I don't think Facebook's there.
I'm very glad we did get to the Facebook question, but to conclude, one of the wonderful questions that came in via email was, where do you draw the line? What are the aspects of religion that we should steer clear of?
Well, look, I think, there are some obvious things, cruel abuses and violence and all the things that, that we know about, and that, the Inquisition and the Crusades, blah, blah, blah. But I think more interestingly, I, as an atheist, there are moments when I have to draw the line with friends who believe or who are spiritual in some way. And often it goes like this. People will say things like, standing outside, it's a beautiful night, looking at the stars, and I say, gosh, it's amazing, one feels so small under this giant cosmos. And they'll go, yeah, absolutely, we do. And then they'll say, it makes you think that there's something there. and at that point, I go, no, not really. And I think that's the moment of difference. So, but by that time, there's a lot of friendship to be had up to that point. So we can enjoy the moon together. Anyway, thank you.